Hi, everybody. Peter Rumsey here. Just as an introduction to the Stanford Building Decarbonization Learning Accelerator, we're a project where we're creating teaching materials on building decarbonization free of charge. Uh, we have 1,200 people who are now using the material, 200 universities, 400 companies. So we have a lot of folks using this material, and we urge you to do the same if you haven't already. And we are constantly updating the material the teaching material that's available there. Also, please let your colleagues know that we're out there. We exist to have more and more folks using this material and information. We at the end will have a little announcement about our next webinar, which is going to be a very interesting one on teaching methodology. So stick around for that. But I'd like to just jump into introducing today's speaker. So Adele Houghton is president of BioSitu, where she works at the intersection of buildings, public health, and climate change. That's amazing. It sounds very exciting. She's a member of the American Institute of Architects College of Fellows and received a Doctor of Public Health degree from Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where she also teaches. Her book, Architectural Epidemiology, proposes a novel method for architectural design combining neighborhood scale environmental health data with participatory community engagement to maximize a building's positive ripple effect on community and planetary health. So Adele has a very exciting webinar today. It's different than what we've done before, so we are looking forward to today's talk. And Adele, I just want to thank you very much for taking the time out to be with us.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Good. And I always like to confirm you guys are seeing what you're supposed to see, right? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Great. So thanks again. And yes, I know this is a little bit of a different topic for an educational program that focuses on decarbonization. But my hope is that by the end of our conversation together, you all will agree with me that actually building decarbonization can be a real game changer in making sure that as we are renovating and building out our cities and communities, that decarbonization strategies are actually at the forefront of protecting human health and promoting social equity. So as Peter said, I'm both an architect and also a doctor of public health. And so we're going to talk kind of at the intersection of those two ideas. And just to kind of warn you, for those of you who are here live with us, we are going to have, hopefully, if we have time, the goal is to have an interactive component of this conversation. So just to kind of keep an eye on your computer, and hopefully you'll be able to participate in about half an hour or so. So get started. So the question I think to start out with is, what is the relationship between decarbonization and public health, and particularly when we think about buildings? So I think probably everybody on this call knows that buildings are responsible for about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But from a public health perspective, we also think of buildings as the primary place of refuge that society goes to protect ourselves during and after climate change related events. I'd say probably the only natural disaster where we go outside are earthquakes. And so when we're thinking about how we're designing and new buildings and renovating existing ones, when we're thinking about how we're going to decarbonize our transportation system, we have to think about buildings and transportation and land use as part of the underlying fundamental infrastructure of resilience for society, and that many of those strategies that we're using to accelerate decarbonization towards a fossil fuel-free future are also the same strategies that, if we deploy them in the right way, could also protect occupants within buildings and residents of neighborhoods. The other way that the built environment is connected to both climate change and public health is that buildings and streets, urban design, are kind of the physical manifestation in many cases of historical segregation and sort of the sorting of different populations into different areas of the city. And what we've seen through the public health literature is that if you go look at where are the populations clustered who are at greatest exposure to climate change related hazards like extreme heat, like flooding, like storm surge, those tend to be the populations that are also marginalized, are lower income. And so they're both exposed to these climate change related hazards. They don't have access necessarily to the aspects of the built environment that could be protective. We think about heat, you could think about green space and trees and appropriate insulation and access to air conditioning. Many of those are also strategies that are related to exposure to flooding as well. And so you can see that there's a relationship there between the social conditions and regulations that we as architects and people working in the built environment are responding to that leads us to, particularly historically, be part of the group of people in society that have resulted in this kind of clustering of some populations in areas of town that are more exposed to hazards and other populations in parts of town that are less exposed to hazards. And so there's a relationship there between how we build and maintain the built environment and the extent to which those strategies increase greenhouse gas emissions, and whether or not those strategies are also protecting the population from exposure to extreme heat, flooding, and other climate change related hazards. And so I'm just going to kind of take a step back and frame this conversation from the perspective of somebody who works in the built environment profession. So if you say are in the architecture or engineering or sustainability consulting, you're kind of in the consulting class, what you end up, the way that you kind of start your projects usually is either a client comes to you and they've got an idea for a project and a location for it, or the client issues an RFP, and so you have to go make recommendations about what you would suggest to do for that property, but that property is already identified for you. And so the way that our current system is set up through building codes, through regulations, and through best practice guides is really to say there's this kind of growing body of evidence-based strategies that have been validated for kind of individual benefits. And we want to try and incorporate as many of them as we can in our project. And it's, we already know what the location is. And so we look at what is the budget and what are the regulations. And based on those two considerations and the goals of the client, we just cram as many of them as possible into the building. And then we say, the more of them you provide, the higher, say, LEED rating you get, or, the better this building is, within quotes. And the hope is that the more of them we incorporate, the better that impact will be on the environment and also on human health. But since we're starting from a place of, let's just look at a menu of options and just cram as many of them into the project as possible, we actually don't know, are we being responsive to the actual needs of that location, that group of people who are going to be using the property, and the surrounding neighborhood? Because every time you build on a site, you're having a ripple effect on the surrounding neighborhood. And so I want to kind of go into a little bit more depth about that idea using a specific example. And this is really more of an allegory. It's based on my 20 plus years of experience in the field. It's a kind of a compilation of different projects that I've worked on. It's not an individual project that you could identify. But so let's just imagine a new medical clinic on a hill. People in the neighborhood are glad to have medical care so close by, but they wonder if it was worth losing access to the fresh vegetables that were in the community garden that was paved over to make way for the clinic. They've also noticed that buildings down the hill have started flooding when it rains. And the road to the clinic is clogged with traffic now. So kids don't play outside anymore, and the pollution and danger of being run over are just too great. This is a project that received a lead, or I don't want to like say any individual project or best practice guide type, but this type of scenario happens within all of the leading green and healthy building rating systems. You can achieve a really high rating and still cause this kind of inadvertent negative environmental and health effects on the surrounding community, because the people that worked on this project, they followed all the rules. They were actually following the instructions that were laid out for them. The problem is that those instructions and the regulations and all of the kind of way that we approach design and construction doesn't consider anything outside of the property line. It really focuses on how the work that you're doing is going to make a difference within that property line. And we know, as I said before, that anytime you make a change to any part of a community fabric, it's like, sitting on a bed, you start moving the quilt starts moving as a result of it. And so it's important to recognize that we have the ability now through data and through community-based participatory approaches to learning what the goals are and the needs are of the neighborhood, to take that library of strategies that we've been building over the past 20 or 30 years and apply it specifically to the site in a way that will help maximize the benefits and minimize any potential co-harms. And so I think the question here is, why is it that our way of constructing and designing works this way, that it's got this kind of disconnect between what's going on inside the property line and the reality of the economic and social and environmental ripple effects that any change to that property is going to have, positive and negative. And so one way I like to think about that is a social science framework that's called the social ecological model. And so what it says is basically the same person could be looking at a situation and have different ways of communicating and making decisions depending on what role they're playing in that moment. So I'll use an example as myself. So I'm a homeowner, and I live in a neighborhood that has small bungalows. There are probably 10 on each side of the block. And so when we have an empty house next door to us. So my thought as a homeowner is I would really like whoever buys that property next door to us to renovate it as a home and have a single family live there, right? Because that's going to maintain the property value in our neighborhood. It's going to add another neighbor to my, to our block. And it's going to retain my access to light and, nature and things like that. If I go up one scale to the relationship scale, then I kind of put on my architect and green and healthy building consultant hat. And I think, it would be really great if that property next door, when it's renovated, if they put in a geothermal heat pump and they had a solar array and a battery, and maybe they, we could hook up with them and we could become a neighborhood microgrid. I start thinking along the lines probably of a lot of kind of conversations you all tend to have on this project, in this series. When I go up one level from that, let's say I'm working with the planning department in my city. Well, we might be thinking about the neighborhood where I live and how that particular property, we want to make sure that it fits within the larger zoning of the neighborhood, regardless of whether the people who own that property want to renovate it as a single family home, right? We're thinking more in terms of like, what's the benefit of this one property to the larger community? And then from the society level, if you think about like cities policymakers, they might be thinking about the community microgrid as an example as well, because they're trying to kind of aggregate up to the community level so that the entire city eventually becomes carbon neutral. But you can see that the decisions that I'm going to make and the recommendations that I would make related to what should happen on that property are going to be slightly different. And the kinds of economic decisions I'm making are going to be different too, because I'm working with different pots of money, right? So that's sort of the way that we end up in a situation of fragmentation, where the property owner isn't necessarily connected to really understanding why they should spend their own money, say, to do something that would benefit the neighborhood, as an example. And so what we need to do as a field is break down those silos and help build a conversation so that it's easy for each level of the social ecological model to recognize both what they would give and what they would get anytime these types of decisions are made. And so the way that I'm proposing that we do that is a new kind of method that's called architectural epidemiology. And so it takes this idea of architecture and turns it into, or reimagines it as a mechanism for promoting community and planetary health. We recognize that we're making a change on an individual piece of land. We also recognize that when we do that, it's going to have a ripple effect. And we recognize also that the scope of our control is not the same as the scope of, say, the planning commissioner's control, but we are contributing to other scales of that social ecological model and what they want. And we need to be aware of that and take advantage of it so that everybody ends up winning every time a property is redeveloped or developed for the first time. And so the way that architectural epidemiology works is it's basically like a problem-solving approach. So first you analyze what are the baseline environmental health kind of conditions on and around your site. So this is a bit of a expansion of, or sort of going into a little bit more depth of what we typically think of as the site assessment step in the project development process. And then we identify what the exposure pathways are that could be most effectively influenced by this particular building. So what are the activities that are going to happen on this site? And how are those activities could they potentially have the greatest positive impact for people on the site and then in the surrounding neighborhood? We then identify what the mediating factors would be. For example, is this going to be a preschool? So we've got a group of sensitive individuals in that location because they're children, and children are at higher risk of, say, heat exhaustion if they're exposed to heat, things like that. And then we use evidence-based design strategies to identify which are the approaches that would bring the greatest benefits and ultimately lead on aggregate at the population level to greater health outcomes. The way that this kind of approach is structured, it draws from two fields within epidemiology. So epidemiology is the science within public health of addressing population health risk. So it's the method that we use in public health to map exposure pathways and understand why certain populations are getting sick or are thriving, and trying to manipulate those pathways so that there's not disparities, so that everybody has access to the greatest potential to living a healthy life. And so the way that we do those, that mapping exercise kind of depends on they're kind of different flavors of it. And so the architectural epidemiology pulls from two of them. One is environmental epidemiology, which tends to focus on exposures to environmental hazards, and then social epidemiology, which tends to look at the social structures that result in different populations living and working in different conditions of risk. This is the overall conceptual framework. In the resources section associated with this webinar, there's an article that walks through kind of what this framework is and how it works. I'm really just going to walk through it very briefly to give you a general idea of what we're talking about. And then we're going to go through a case study that hopefully will bring it kind of down to the ground. So when we start by, let's say we go back to that initial slide I showed you guys with the building, right? We're starting our project. So we know where the property is located. And so if we want to think about it from a perspective of environmental hazards, think about where you live or where you tend to work or where a project is, where you're currently living or currently working. From an environmental perspective, that community probably is exposed to a certain set of environmental hazards. Let's say I live in Houston, Texas, so the hazards that we tend to be exposed to are things like hurricanes, extreme heat, air pollution, and flooding, right? Just generally, those are the hazards that we tend to be exposed to across the region. And then from a social epidemiological perspective, which is the bottom half of this, you can think about sort of what are the social structures within that community that lead to inequitable distributions of populations. So, for example, in Houston, we are famous for not having zoning, and the original way that neighborhoods were set out, there were legal requirements that excluded certain groups of people, particularly essentially anyone who wasn't white, and in some of them they also excluded people who were Jewish. And there's was a period of reformation that happened over the course of the 20th century to remove those discriminatory features from our bylaws of our neighborhoods. However, you can still see the legacy of that. There still is a lot of racial segregation across Houston. So that would be a way of kind of looking at the environmental hazards of the whole community. Then what you want to do is look at the environmental exposures on that particular site, right? So let's say this is a property that's located right next to the freeway. From an environmental epidemiological perspective, you'd want to think, well, how far is it from the freeway? Which way does the wind direct? And what is the concern in terms of types of exposures to air pollution related to this particular site? From the perspective of social epidemiology, you would then say, well, we know kind of what the historical structure is, or social kind of history of this community. Well, let's look a little bit more closely into this neighborhood. Do we see a difference in kind of the groups of populations that are living and working in this neighborhood versus others? Are they at higher exposure to that air pollution for social reasons? And kind of keep that in the consideration as you then move even more specifically into the realm of the built environment. So you say, all right, we know that this is a site located next to the freeway, but are there things that have already been incorporated into the property or near the property that have, say, exposed it more? Maybe there's a lot of impervious surface, a lot of street between us and the freeway, or maybe less. Maybe there's already a wall or a row of bushes, or maybe they've moved us further back away from that exposure. Those are the built environment determinants of health. It's kind of the baseline of what you start with when you do the design. And then similarly, thinking about from the social side, who's already in the neighborhood and how are they being exposed, and how is that related to the potential use for the property once the design is completed. And then this is where we fit in. We provide the point of intervention. We are going to change what is the current kind of baseline using our design and development intervention. And we're going to do that ideally thinking through how this particular design could particularly benefit sensitive populations. So like I talked before about, let's say it's a nursery or a preschool or something like that. You might think about, well, what are the aspects of that particular group of people that makes them highly sensitive to exposure to air pollution? Well, are there ways that we can particularly design the property to protect that group from that particular hazard? And so the goal here is that by being explicit and strategic about the way that we use the capital, that we're using on this particular property or this construction project, that we can make changes that will reduce the risk of negative exposures and create conditions that improve the probability of positive health outcomes. So an example, taking the idea of a property that's next to the freeway. I worked on a project a number of years ago where children were trying to walk to school. The school was right next to a freeway. There was no safe way for them to walk. The neighborhood was on one side of the freeway, the school was on the other, and there was no safe way for them to walk under the freeway to get to school. And some of them, this is a high school, they played football at night, and so they would have to walk across this freeway in the dark with no sidewalks, right? So that would be if this project was able to collaborate with the surrounding the properties next door, the Department of Transportation that the children were going to have to walk across, that through the advocacy of this particular project, you could end up with a safer route between their home and the school that would be health promoting. And then finally, we can understand that all of us probably work at different scales in the design field. Some of us work at very small interior scale, like say making choices around artificial lighting. Others of us maybe work at large scales, like redesigning transportation systems. So this framework actually works at all of those scales. And one of the ways that it tries to break through those silos that we talked about before in the socio-ecological model is to scale jump. So to help decisions that are being made, say about renovating the school that I just shared, with decisions that were happening at that moment in time around should we expand the freeway, right? Having those two groups of people coordinate together and find areas of mutual benefit so that the work that was going on at smaller scales within the school property and the work that was going on at a very large regional scale related to the highway, that they could coordinate and result in something that would be more beneficial than if they were working in their silos. And then the final piece of this on the right-hand side, you can see that the way that health outcomes happen is sort of dependent on the disease or health condition that you're talking about, right? So we can say that we've seen studies that you move a child from a home that has a lot of triggers for asthma, then you move them into a place where there are very few or no triggers for asthma, you can see a very quick benefit there to their health, that they stop going to the emergency department, that they're able to participate more in physical activities and go to school. That's a very quick turnaround. Some of these other environmental exposures maybe could lead to cancer decades down the line. So it's important for us. I know sometimes it can be hard to create that reason, why would I care about, not why should this particular project be engaged in a conversation about a health outcome that might happen decades down the line? I think, again, we'll talk about that in a minute. It has to do with aligning different stakeholders' needs and values, and rather than simply placing all of your decisions into a pro forma that's sort of one line item at the next, which kind of leads into that fragmentation, which is is the root cause of that medical clinic allegory on the hill. So I'm going to give you a brief project example to give you an idea of sort of how this conceptual model works in reality. This is a project. This larger work is a project that I've been building out for about a little bit over 15 years. We have a demo now that was part of your resources that are associated with this webinar. It's called the alignment process. And this is one of the case studies that's on that demo. But we're getting close to 10 at this point. You can go look at the different analyses that we've done of different types of projects in different parts of the country, and how they lead to different outcomes depending on where they're located and what kind of activities are going to be on that site, and then also how they link over to the right-hand side of this diagram, which is the local policies. So what we're going to talk about right now is a mixed income housing development in the Bronx. And we're going to kind of walk through this diagram very briefly, and then the interactive part of our conversation will be giving you all a chance to kind of try out how would you make use of this information if you were, say, going to use it to design the affordable housing development yourself, or work with your students to do something like that, maybe either as an exercise around site assessment, or an exercise around a design studio, or an exercise around impact assessments. So the diagram is divided into two parts. The left-hand side are analysis. It's an analysis of the neighborhood conditions, and we'll walk through that data, which has been sort of grouped into 3 buckets. And based on the way that those metrics, the high priority metrics at the neighborhood scale, that's a census tract scale, how they relate to each other in the body of literature and the public health literature, we're able to prioritize a small number of environmental health topics that this particular project could have the greatest benefit if they were incorporated into the final design. So that's the left-hand side of the diagram. The right-hand side of the diagram is related to solutions. So this third column is the one that you guys are probably most familiar with. These are all evidence-based design and operations strategies that are at the building, the campus, and the community scale. And then the right-hand column has to do with the community policies and how you link what you're doing on an individual property to the larger conversation happening in the community. So this is the process we're going to go through. We first do a neighborhood scan of existing data sets. We then use that information to identify neighborhood health priorities that this particular design could impact. We then link them over to evidence-based design strategies that come from well-known and validated best practice guides like LEAD and WELL and Fit Well and Living Future. And then we link those metrics to one scale up. How are they going to contribute to the different community goals, whether it's decarbonization, climate resilience, community health? And so for this particular project, and this is where you want to pay attention because we're going to use this information in a second. We organize the neighborhood scan into 3 different buckets of information. So the top bucket are called the social determinants of health. These are the demographic and social kind of disparities that we see can have a direct impact on people's access to, say, healthcare and the ability to live a healthy life. The second bucket here are community health indicators. So this is health status. You know, to what extent do you see adults in this neighborhood self-reporting that they're obese or that they have asthma or that they suffer from depression? That's what the second one is. And those are all of the ones that we incorporate into this model are chronic illnesses or conditions that the evidence would show that changing the built environment could contribute to improving those conditions. And then the third are climate change and health criteria. And so these are the climate change related exposures that are specific to the neighborhood, and they're a combination of the actual environmental exposure and the extent to which there are sensitive populations that are located in that neighborhood. When you have the combination of a high exposure and a high level of sensitive populations, then you end up with a high vulnerability. So for the social determinants of health, that's the first bucket. What we find in this census tract is that there's a very high level of social vulnerability, which means that we've got a group of people living in this neighborhood who are probably a combination of communities that have been historically marginalized, maybe low income, and so have a harder time accessing healthcare, education, things like that. You can also see that this is a high percentage of Hispanic, Latinx, and African American residents, and a very low percentage of Asian Americans. Then from the median household income, you can see that this is comparing this particular census tract, it's $43,000 median household income. The comparison lines are showing you larger geographic scales. So the second line is the Bronx, the third line is New York City, the fourth line is New York State, and the top is the US. And you can see that the median household income in this particular census tract is it's almost half what it is in New York City and New York State. And then the poverty status is also probably about 30% higher than New York City and New York State. And so this identifies, it gives you kind of a picture of who's living in that neighborhood right now. And given the fact that this is a project that's going to introduce mixed income housing, doing this kind of analysis would help validate the reason why it makes sense. Maybe not to just put affordable housing, but also to have mixed income, maybe some market rate housing to kind of start building a more mixed income neighborhood, which the evidence shows are the kinds of neighborhoods where you have the most social mobility, greater health benefits, et cetera. So then if we look at the community health indicators, you can see that even though this is in New York City, it is very unsafe for pedestrians. So 114.5 age-adjusted rate of pedestrian injuries going to the emergency department for every 100,000 residents. Like, that is a lot. So thinking about the fact that you're in a place that has the great bones for being a walkable community, but maybe there's a behavioral shifts that happen because it's so unsafe for pedestrians. And then here you can see that 63% use public transit, walking, or cycling to commute to work. So you have a group of people that, if we could make it a safer pedestrian environment and cycling environment, would be likely to use it. So that would be another consideration you'd incorporate into your design process. The Bronx has a pretty high percentage of food insecurity, so that would be something to think about. Is this potentially located in a food desert? You can see here that it has a high number of bodegas compared to supermarkets, so that if there's an opportunity to have some kind of food outlet within the ground floor of this property, that might be something that you would want to incorporate into the design if that's possible. And then another reason why that would potentially be important is that it has a pretty high percent of obese adults. And so giving them, one of the reasons why that might be is potentially not having easy access to affordable, healthy food. Another reason might have to do with the lack of safety in the physical environment. And so it's more, I guess, safer to live a more sedentary lifestyle. So again, thinking about those conditions and how your design could help alleviate them or become a leverage point within the larger neighborhood. And then finally, in terms of climate change and health, the neighborhood has a high exposure to truck traffic, air pollution, which is a known carcinogen. And so, for example, one of the case studies in my book that's in the Bronx, one of the affordable housing developments tried to address that by creating pedestrian-only areas within like several block radius to try and give people a space where they could get away from that truck traffic, because we see that the diesel and those larger particulate matter, they actually will fall to the ground within a few hundred feet of the exposure. So that's one of the ways that you can protect the population from that type of thing. But it also is one of those places where you start thinking about advocacy. Are there ways to reroute trucks? Could it be incorporated as part of the larger city's decarbonization strategies for shifting over to, say, electric trucks, things like that, that there's a connection there between the exposure to the air pollution in these types of neighborhoods and goals for decarbonization of the transportation system. And then you can see here also that heat, over on the right, we've got 4 indicators for heat. So this is a high risk neighborhood for heat. That's sort of the bottom line. And so then the question is, are there strategies that we could use that both advance goals for decarbonization and also are designed to reduce exposure to heat? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. There are many of them. So this is I want to give you a quick review to look at, now that we've identified kind of these are the main priority indicators, that when we put them together and look at them in the kind of the larger lens of public health literature, we see that design strategies that focus on trying to address obesity, heat, and traffic-related air pollution, those strategies combined would actually contribute to addressing most of the high priority indicators in the neighborhood. And so when you look at these lines, you can see that they're color coded to go with each of the high priority environmental health topics. And you can see that some of them, for example, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension are connected to many of the social determinants of health, as well as the other neighborhood considerations. And there are 5 design strategies that we could use to try to address that issue. With heat, you can see a lot of overlap between the design strategies that we're looking at here as options and how they can benefit the neighborhood. And then for the traffic-related air pollution, you can see that as well. And so when you look at them all together, the idea is that the more lines that are together, that means that this individual design strategy or this individual environmental health priority are addressing more than one thing, which is what we want. We're going for co-benefits. We're trying to find a way to use a small number of design strategies to have the greatest positive impact. On the right-hand side, we mapped these the metrics associated with these design strategies over to New York City Climate Action Plan, their environmental and health data portal. They have a food insecurity plan, and their green building requirements. And so you can see that it's possible for this individual project to both show the neighborhood how they're going to tangibly benefit the neighborhood and address some of those environmental health concerns in the neighborhood on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, it can show the city, when you go to have your conversation about trying to get your permit, that you're the suite of topics that you're addressing and that the types of design strategies that you're emphasizing are going to also contribute to goals that the city has that are maybe beyond the property. And this is a real benefit because many cities don't actually track the role that an individual project might have on their overall goals, whether they're decarbonization goals or resilience goals, or public health goals. And so by making this connection between the neighborhood scale data to show need and the metrics that show action, you're able to connect over to the role that the private sector is having and could be measured, that is contributing to policy goals. And again, what we found in our research is that being able to show and measure what that benefit would be for both groups, community and local government, is a real benefit for the development team. It changes the conversation into showing that the community benefit is in fact happening. So I'm going to stop here and we're going to jump over to, oh, whoops, I didn't mean to stop sharing. We're going to jump over to a Miro board and do the engagement. Lindsay, could you put the link to the Miro board in the chat?
Yes.
Great, thanks. And I know we only have 15 minutes left, or really probably 10, so that we can have a closeout. So what we're going to do is just sort of give you guys a taste of what it would be like to present the presentation that I just shared with you all to your class, and then work with your class on moving that kind of conceptual idea, learning about that case study, which you can see the diagram is over here on the right, easy for you to use, and then turning it into something that they can use to further their own thinking. And I'll tell you that we've used this approach, this exercise, with architecture students, with public health students, with real estate students, and all of them get the concept, and we've tailored it to the needs of the class. So like if the goal for the class is to, say, develop an impact assessment of the neighborhood that takes into account environmental and social and government that could be the final outcome, would be more on the policy level. If it's a design studio, then the outcome is really focused on the design. So I want to keep in mind that the flexibility of this particular activity. And it's great to see all of you guys there. For those of you who haven't used Miro board before, the way it works, I've set up a bunch of sticky notes that we can use. But if you want more sticky notes, they're over here on the left. And you just grab it and move it over. And the way that you write, and I see some people have already started writing, is you just click on the sticky note and then you double click and you start writing. But so to start out with, I don't know if everybody's allowed to be off mute or not, but if you are, you can shout things out, or you can start adding things to the Miro board, or you can put things in the chat and Lindsay will either add them or shout them out and I'll add them. But so the first step here, you can see up here at the top of the screen, we're going to just kind of walk through the process that we just went through in the presentation. So again, this is a mixed income affordable housing development in the Bronx in New York City. So who might be the stakeholders who are going to be involved in that process? So if you're like, say, the development team or the design team, who are going to be the stakeholders that you're going to be talking to as you decide how you're going to design this project? So we've got the design team there as a stakeholder, city board, great. Residents, great. Developer, yeah. Maybe surrounding business owners, maybe there's a school nearby. These are maybe there's
housing officials.
Affordable housing officials, that's great. So here, I'm just going to add. Great, local businesses, yeah. So thinking about, who, maybe we've got an environmental justice organization. So those are our stakeholders. Now, thinking about those stakeholders, they're going to have different concerns, right? They're not all going to have the same concern. So and this is the orange line here, what are the environmental and health hazards that those stakeholders we see on the top, that they might be concerned about? So we have one person who might be concerned about NOx emissions. Yeah, that's great. That's a traffic-related air pollution. All right. Other environmental and health hazards that some people might be concerned about. And this can be one of the ones that it can be helpful to have students from different disciplines in this kind of class, because everybody's going to come in with their own kind of set of expertise. This is the column that the public health students find the easiest. The design strategies are the ones that they're like, I have no idea. And the design strategies are the ones that the design students find the easiest. So it's really helpful to have multiple disciplines in the class when you're doing this. Let's see, impervious surface, indoor air quality, particulate matter. Great. I'm going to put food desert just to kind of throw another one in there. All right. So then environmental exposures that are connected to those hazards. So like, let's say indoor air quality is your hazard. How are you exposed to that? And that's the green line. If it's a food desert, what's the environmental exposure that makes it a food desert? That's what the green columns are. And I know we're kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to I'm going to say for food desert, we'd say no grocery stores, for example. Maybe for indoor air quality, there are all kinds of environmental hazards that could be associated with that. There could be poorly maintained buildings, for example. Heat islands, the exposure might be impervious surface, right? So no trees. And so what you want to do, the reason why we're using Miro board is that you can link things, right? So you click on the thing that you want to link and you see this little button, and then you pull it over to the other side. So I'm going to link heat island with impervious surface. I'm going to link it to no trees, right? Gas stove, indoor air quality, great. Food desert, no.
Question, actually, really quick.
Yes.
What about affordability gentrification? Where does that fit in?
That is a great question. I would put that as an environmental exposure personally. But some of these things, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is this is not a diagram that only goes left to right. So as you start building it out, you might find that, for example, sensitive populations, your residents might actually be a sensitive population, right? Like maybe they're low income. So you might connect them over to that group. And then the last thing over here, the blue line, the blue set of Post-its is where you start talking about design strategies. And I'm going to end it there because we're kind of getting to the end of this time, and maybe we have time for one question. But my experience as an architect and a green and healthy building consultant is we tend to start at this blue column. And I've now been talking with you guys for 50 minutes. And we finally got to the blue column. And to me, that's like the fundamental difference between taking an architectural epidemiology approach, an approach that's going to really be designed to try and be responsive to the community and environmental needs of the neighborhood, and demonstrate what the benefits are of that decarbonization approach. You can't start with a decarbonization strategy. The decarbonization strategy ends up being in service of meeting the identified needs of that neighborhood and of the people that are going to use that building. So I'm gonna end with one last slide. We're gonna make these slides available to everybody, but we have some resources that are available to everybody who participates in this webinar and watches the recording. The alignment process website, as I mentioned before, it has a number of demos, including the one that we're looking at in the Bronx. It also has a playbook that kind of walks you step by step through the process that is intended to be used in the academic environment to as sort of kind of the underpinning for a curriculum. It's also meant to be used out in the field for real projects, and particularly project-based learning. It could be really useful in the academic environment. Architectural Epidemiology, the book, is about to come out. Its release date is May 6th, and we have a discount code if you guys are interested in it. It's designed as both a resource to be used out in the field, as well as a book that could be used as the basis for the curriculum of a course, or integrated into parts of courses. And then we created a template of this Miro board that we've all been working with. So you can go in there to this QR code and duplicate that template and make use of it for free. And if you do, let me know how it works. And I am also always available to answer questions. I do a lot of guest teaching, so I'd be happy to collaborate. I'm looking to build a community of practice around architectural epidemiology. So I'll just close it there, just with a big thank you for inviting me to be a part of this group, and look forward to staying in touch with everybody.
Great. Adele, thank you so much. We've been talking for years about integrative design on buildings, where we look at the different systems and the facade and building envelope interactions. But this is like taking the idea integrated design to more of the community level. So I love that. And I think that we'll be more successful with that approach. And then also we'll be able to figure out ways to make these things affordable. And I think so one of the people did mention that affordability thing. And I think that that's really what we need to always keep in mind, is how do we make these things affordable and breakthrough. I also really appreciate what you're saying about the health effects of what we do on buildings. And it's actually Harvard Chan School of Public Health that did a study that said 1 in 5 deaths globally is associated with the burning of fossil fuels. So
yeah, I think that they were looking at just at air pollution. So
yeah.
That's actually an undercount.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering.
So, we do talk a lot about climate change and the impacts of using fossil fuels and climate change and all those things. And, when we talk about decarbonization, it really sort of points in that direction. But the thing that we oftentimes forget to talk about is the immediate health impacts on people today. So both are really important. And I think what the work you're doing is helping to remind us of that and help us find solutions for that. So thank you very much. Very enlightening. I do want to tell everybody that our next webinar is also a really exciting one. We have Robin Potok, who just wrote a book on teaching carbon neutral design, 20 unique perspectives. So Robin got 20 different professors to talk about their approach for teaching low energy building design, architects and engineers. And one of our longtime collaborators, Nia Malou from Howard University, wrote one of those chapters. So I think it will be a really stimulating discussion, especially for those of you who are teachers, professors, and the like. And I would urge you to think about what Adele talked about with the Mira board and getting students to engage in that type of activity. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As I said at the introduction, we've got a lot going on in our Stanford BDLA website, which is bdla.stanford.edu. So do go there. And if you have any feedback on this webinar, we would welcome it. Lindsay Franta has been the one sending out and corresponding with you about the webinar. Feel free to reach out to her and give us some feedback one way or another. And also, if you have any suggestions for future webinars, that would be fantastic. So thanks again, Adele. Big thank you. And we'll see you in the next webinar, which is, let me give you the date. The next one is Thursday, May 22nd at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you.